We talked about what Critical Role did right in Campaign 3 in our last video. Now it's time to dive into what they may have gotten wrong, and why Bell's Hells was such a divisive campaign for some of the critters. A quick caveat just before we see it pop up in the comments, yes, Critical Role is a game played by friends for friends, but this is also undeniably a business now too. The whole we do things just for the table's enjoyment doesn't really apply when you've also made that campaign the core of your financial model for your creator-owned company, so we feel like some criticism is warranted, as this is a product made ultimately for profit in public consumption that relies on views and subscriptions. That said, we still love Campaign 3. This is us sort of nitpicking at some flaws, hoping that we won't see them going forward in Campaign 4. And as always, we'd really appreciate it if you like the video and subscribe to the channel, as it's free and it really helps us keep churning out videos like this. So all that said, let's take a deep breath and talk about the 3 big pitfalls of Critical Role Campaign 3. So when it comes to the 3 areas of Campaign 3 that may have lost some of the critters, let's start with the big one: the serious lack of stakes and consequences. Bell's Hells made a ton of nonsensical and occasionally borderline evil or psychotic decisions, especially in the first half of the campaign, and they simply always got bailed out by some super powerful returning player character or NPC or some other plot device, and just generally never face the repercussions of their wildly out of control at times actions. Percy and Vex never found out about the frankly awful way Imogen and Laudna tried to gaslight their child after Laudna scared her for sort of no reason at all. Every time they needed to travel across the world, a past character like Allura or Keyless showed up and would just teleport or tree walk them. Aurum makes a deal to basically sell his soul to Nanamori to keep his friends safe, and Nanamori grants him all the powers of the deal, and then at the end goes, "Nah, I was just kidding, the deal never happened." Even Ashton tries to basically steal a second Titan shard from the party, and he just takes some damage and spits it out, and everyone moves past it in the next episode. Laudna tries to steal Odahan's sword and attacks Aurum, and that's resolved in the space of about an hour, and there are just too many examples to name, but the show ended with a great example, with Ashton trying to sacrifice himself and finally have a really big, noble moment as a character, and then Matt allowing like 18 different preposterous dice rolls, which is the next thing we'll talk about, to try and save him, and then just having Essex show up out of nowhere and shove a bunch of Dunamancy into his skull and just bring him back. No one ever felt like they were truly in danger after Pike showed up to just resurrect Laudna, and Vex tossed over the insane diamond component requirements to bring back a person inhabited by the villain who had made her life and her husband's life an absolute hell for decades. And at that point, it was just hard to care about a ton of people who walked around just absolutely slathered in plot armor no matter how bad they screwed up. If it wasn't for FCG deciding to blow himself up, there would have just been no real lasting consequences whatsoever in Campaign 3, with the exception of the gods, which we'll also talk about later. Secondly, while we greatly respect Matt Mercer as a DM, and we're generally a huge fan of the rule of cool theory to DMing, this campaign Matt might have let the dice rolls decide far too much, and granted dice rolls on things that probably never should have gotten them, which kind of plunged the narrative into chaos and tied into that whole issue with there being no real stakes or consequences we just talked about. There is just no way the big bad of your entire campaign should somehow get bamboozled into never revealing the fall of Aor at the hand of the gods, one of the key elements of his entire plan, just because Laura Bailey rolled a few dice to represent Liliana somehow deceiving lewdness. A brilliant ancient elf planning to take on the gods with a plan that spans over a millennia, and just forgetting to ever release that footage into the world. Likewise, as amazing as that natural 20 was from Imogen to negotiate with the gods into becoming mortal, even that nat 20 should have resulted in some of the gods choosing to turn mortal and others running. The betrayers voluntarily giving up that much power, especially Asmodeus, who seemed to want Predathos freed, just made no sense, but a 20 was rolled and suddenly that just became the story for all of them. And allowing Imogen to roll with advantage to try and fight against the will of Predathos in the first place, all because Fern, who had previously shared no real bond with Imogen and hardly ever talked to them one-on-one for the entire campaign, called out her name, is another example of just allowing dice and the granting of advantage to dice rolls to overpower the narrative of this campaign. Sometimes you have to go where the dice tell you. but Matt was very hesitant to say no to Bell's Hells or even grant them disadvantage on roles when they came up with increasingly less feasible plans across the campaign. And so generally anytime the Hells were in a tight spot, they seemed to be granted enough roles and enough roles with advantage to just get themselves out of it regardless of how it fit the story, which means that even their failures somehow turned into successes. Some of the best moments of Campaign 1 and 2 came from the failures of Vox Machina and the Mighty Nine, and Campaign 3 just kind of brute forced their way past that with a huge amount of dice rolls, which again just made it really hard to root for them when you knew that nothing was really going to slow them down, as they would just keep asking for and almost always being granted chances to roll on wildly improbable things. Like Laudna somehow using her movement to stick her face into a mask belted onto Breas' waist under his clothes anytime things got rough. And it just felt like that happened far, far too often in Campaign 2, and it ties back into that whole issue of there just not being a lot of stakes. And finally, we need to talk about how Campaign 3 almost became a parody of Critical Role at points. Everyone was a jokey Chaos Crew character. Everyone was in a ship with another cast member at some point. Liam just keeps making his character sadder and sadder. They basically turned all the extremes up to 11 but forgot the core element that made Campaign 1 and 2's cast so good, a true sense of found family and friendship. These people didn't ever really develop anywhere near the bond outside of their respective ships that the other cast did, possibly because they never truly had to face failure and adversity along the way for the reasons we just talked about. FCG's death was largely forgotten just a few episodes later, and became a running joke with the cast always forgetting to tell Frida it ever happened. Everyone was so busy trying to play the next Jester that there was no real cohesion or bond among them as a party. They just kept on making chaos decisions and running off in different directions over and over and over. So in the end, things like Imogen and Fern suddenly having some sort of strong emotional bond because the story required them to have that just fell flat. When Molly died in Campaign 2, it led to serious consequences that shaped the entire campaign. The party was split and imprisoned. It led to a search and rescue operation that really helped both chunks of the party bond together as a family, and everyone had a chance to explore their backstory and their history over their own story arcs, like we got with Captain Ford, or Knott's transformation, or Caleb's horrific, childhood and training as a wizard. Whereas Campaign 3 just kind of became the Imogen and Laudna show for big chunks. We got to meet Fern's family, but she didn't really seem to know what to do with them besides to show off how quirky and weird they were. We got about 2 episodes of Chetney's nonsense backstory that was just a rehash of the Christmas special that his character was lifted from in the first place. And we barely got anything for FCG and Ashton, as we just kept getting dragged off into weird side quests and character cameos from past seasons instead. So we never really got a chance to have those long character-specific arcs to flesh out the characters and get a chance to know them and see them learn to know each other, like we did in Campaign 1 and 2. Basically, we got tossed into 100 episodes of side quests, with a few main plots, Imogen as a Chosen One episodes, and Laudna is dealing with Delilah from Campaign 1 episodes along the way, which, in our opinion at least, didn't lead to a balanced and fleshed out cast with deep connections to each other. Even when they had the player death in the fight against Odahan, instead of Fern just doing what a character with a deep emotional connection might do, just choosing to revivify Orem, who she had known and laughed and adventured with and been friends with far longer than the week and a half she had known Laudna, she just rolled a dice to randomize who to bring back. There was just no real sense of family until the narrative kind of forced there to be at the very end, and that just didn't feel organic and kind of fell flat because of it. Compared to Campaign 1 or 2, they just never felt like a cohesive unit, and they just certainly never felt like a family. Now, all that said, this was still a good season, and one that we enjoyed. We just felt like, knowing this was the end of an era, the cast sort of wanted to get a lot of ideas and weirdness out of their system, and they managed to do that while still making us laugh and cry and generally have a great time. But in Campaign 4, we just hope they look back on this and realize where they may have gone off the rails with Bell's Hells, and come back to form with the first and second campaigns that really put Critical Role on the map. And we have every faith that that is exactly what they'll do when Critical Role Campaign 4 finally does return, sometime this summer. So what do you think about Campaign 3? Were we too harsh on the... So what do you think about Campaign 3? Are these criticisms too harsh, or do you agree that some things needed to be changed. Let us know down in the comments, and don't forget to hit those like and subscribe buttons.